Hey guys, Chef Ro here. Today I'm going to make pie dough, and I'm going to use this one for an apple galette freeform pie, which I'll show you in a minute. So there's a tradition in some parts of the country where they put a slice of cheddar cheese on top of the apple pie. So what I've done is I put a little bit of cheddar cheese in the dough because that'll tenderize the pie dough because the cheese will get in the way of the gluten formation. So I'm going to show you how to make a cheddar cheese pie dough for an apple pie. You could also use it for a vegetable pie or a quiche or something. It would be very, very delicious as well. So the first things first, we're going to put the dry ingredients in here. I've got sugar, salt, and flour. Whisking is the best way to do this, just because it'll make sure to also get out any lumps of flour that you might have. It'll make sure all the ingredients are really well incorporated. So you're going to want to whisk that together. I used a little bit of whole wheat flour in here, even though the recipe didn't call for it, in part to make it a little healthier, but it shouldn't affect the texture, the minimal proportion that I used. This is a half a recipe here of the pie dough that I have posted, and I used only 2 tablespoons of whole wheat flour and a half a cup of all-purpose flour. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add our butter. Now this butter I have already cubed and put back into the refrigerator while I was measuring everything else out, because it's important that the butter stay very, very cold while you are making your pie dough. If you're going to do it in a food processor, which is just fine, you actually want to cube it and then freeze the butter. If you're doing it by hand, cubing it and refrigerating the butter is plenty. Now you have to determine what kind of pie you're making. If you're making a very, very wet pie or something that has a lot of grease in it, something like a pate or a meat pie, you need to get the butter all the way down to where the mixture looks like wet sand. It's called a mealy pie dough. If you want the texture very, very flaky and not quite as sturdy, then you want to get the butter or the other fat that you're using to about the size of peas. Now this is called a pastry cutter. Okay, I've already shown you one way to do it. You can freeze the butter and then grate it like we did for the biscuits. That works very well here for pie dough as well. So I just wanted to show you a different way. So this thing is called a pastry cutter, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut this butter. Now you can use 2 knives if you want. You can use your fingers. The fingers get really tricky because then you'll warm up the butter, and you've got to have it cold, 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 cold. It is sincerely the biggest trick to pie dough is keeping everything ice cold. Okay, so you see I've got a couple pieces that just don't want to cut. Keep going. You basically see how I'm doing this rocking motion with this funny looking device, and I'm getting this down to pea size. Okay. So now I've got my butter down to pea size. If you've got a couple of pieces that are big, you can just use your fingers to cut those in to a different size. Now, if you use a little bit of shortening, especially if you don't use the cheddar in here, a little bit of shortening is actually going to make it a little bit flakier as well, because it has a higher melting point. So the starches will start to gelatinize and the pie crust will start to set before the fat melts out of it. So that will leave a pocket behind that makes it flakier. Okay, so you can see I've got about pea-sized pieces of butter. Now I'm going to just toss in my cheese. Okay, did about 4 teaspoons of cheddar. Now that I've got this all done, ice water. Notice there's ice cubes in here because you need everything, again, to stay cold, cold, cold. And the reason behind that, you guys, is because what you need to do is have ice cold pie dough going into a nice hot oven. Then it'll take the water content of the fat and turn it into steam, and that's what creates the flaky layers. Notice how I'm not working this super hard. I'm just giving it a little bit of a squeeze. It's a little bit dry still. You can always add more water. It's hard to take it away. And you want it dry enough that it just barely clings together, because we're going to have to let this rest, and that moisture will penetrate the flour molecule more while it's resting, and it'll be softer and wetter. And if it's too soft and too wet, it's going to be really sticky and hard to roll out later. Okay, so I've got it together in a pie dough. Usually when we're working with pie, we want it to be round right? So it's easier to get to the end of round if we start with round. So before we refrigerate this, because you're gonna need to let it rest in the refrigerator for at least 20 minutes, what we're gonna have to do is we're gonna have to make it into a round. And the best way to do that is to think back to the days of Play-Doh. So remember when you made snakes out of Play-Doh, okay? So if you make a snake, turn it on its end and push straight down, it ends up being in a nice round for you. So then it's going to be easier to roll out into a round later, which is what we're going to be looking for the galette. Okay, so that is how you make pie dough. Put it in the refrigerator for at least 20 minutes and you're good to go.